The statues are still standing. That is the part that makes this impossible to ignore. Not hidden in museum basements, not lost to time, not buried under centuries of sediment. They're standing in city centers, outside government buildings, flanking courthouse entrances across Europe and North America, massive stone figures carved at scales that seem perpetually wrong for their surroundings. And every single one of them has been relabeled. Not originally, the plaques weren't always there. The official attributions came later, sometimes decades later, sometimes a full century after the statues were supposedly commissioned. And when those attributions finally appeared, they told a very specific story. Greek revival, Roman influence, neoclassical aesthetics, artistic grandeur, always the same explanations, never mentioning who actually carved them or why they chose proportions that tower over normal humans by 3, sometimes 4 feet, start in Washington, D.C. The statues outside the Capitol building. Official history dates them to the 1820s and 1830s, attributes them to various American and European sculptors working in the classical tradition. But stand in front of them. Actually stand there and look up. These figures aren't just tall because they're on pedestals. The human forms themselves are carved at 9 to 10 feet. The hands alone measure larger than an average person's head. The proportions don't suggest artistic exaggeration. They suggest models. Now go to St. Petersburg. The Atlas figures supporting the entrance to the Hermitage, officially commissioned by Catherine the Great, carved by German and Russian sculptors between 1840 and 1850. Except the architectural plans for those entranceways existed decades before the official commission dates, and the statues themselves show weathering patterns inconsistent with mid-1/9th century installation. They look older, much older, but the plaques say 1840s, so the plaques must be correct. Paris, the caryatids at the Louvre, the giant male figures outside the Palais Garnier, Vienna, the monumental statues flanking the Hofburg Palace. London, the oversized figures at the British Museum entrance. Madrid, St. James, Brussels. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Every major European capital features the same architectural element. Massive humanoid statues carved at proportions that exceed normal human scale by significant margins. All officially attributed to the 18th and 19th centuries. All labeled as artistic interpretations of classical themes. But here is what troubles the official narrative. These statues don't look like artistic interpretations. They look like portraits. The faces aren't idealized. They're individualized. Different bone structures, different expressions, different features, as if the sculptors were working from specific models, not from imagination or classical templates. And the clothing, when present, doesn't match Greek or Roman styles. It matches something else, something closer to Central Asian or Northern European traditional dress. Something that appears in old photographs from Siberia and Mongolia in the 1860s and 1870s. The deeper investigation went, the more patterns emerged that official art history doesn't address. Why do statues commissioned decades apart by different sculptors in different countries share identical proportion systems? Why do the height ratios remain so consistent? These figures consistently measure between 8.5 and 10 feet, when calculated from the carved human form, not including the pedestal. That is not random variation. That is standardization. That is working from a common reference. Academic explanations point to the revival of classical aesthetics, to shared training among European sculptors, to the influence of Renaissance masters who themselves drew on Greco-Roman traditions. Except none of that explains the specific measurements. Classical statuary varies wildly in scale. Roman sculptures range from life-size to monumental, depending on purpose and location. There is no classical standard that produces the exact same proportional system appearing across 19th century European and American architecture, unless the sculptors weren't inventing, unless they were copying, unless they were documenting something they had actually seen. Look at what happened to architectural records during the critical period. The late 1700s and early 1800s, The same window when Tartaria disappears from maps. The same decades when giant skeletons stop being reported in newspapers. The same era when enormous buildings suddenly appear fully formed with suspiciously sparse construction documentation. And right in the middle of this historical fog, we get an explosion of monumental statuary, all featuring the same oversized human proportions. The timing isn't coincidental, it is coordinated. Consider the practical questions. No art historian seems interested in asking, how do you carve a 10-foot stone figure in the 1820s? Not the technique, the logistics. Stone of that size and quality doesn't come from local quarries. It has to be transported, often hundreds of miles. Each statue represents dozens of tons of material. The cranes required to position them didn't officially exist in the capacities needed. The mathematical precision required to balance such massive weights on architectural features requires engineering knowledge that doesn't appear in contemporary construction manuals. Yet somehow, across multiple continents, over a span of just 40 or 50 years, hundreds of these monumental figures appear, all expertly carved, all perfectly balanced, all installed without documented construction delays or engineering failures, as if the people doing this work had done it many times before, as if this wasn't experimental or innovative, as if it was routine. The official explanation collapses when examined against the architectural context. These statues weren't added to buildings as decorative afterthoughts. The buildings were designed around them. The load-bearing calculations account for their weight. The architectural proportions accommodate their scale, which means either the sculptors worked in perfect coordination with architects across multiple countries over multiple decades, or the statues were already part of the architectural plan from the beginning. And if they were part of the original plan, who made that plan? Because the buildings themselves present their own mystery. Government complexes featuring doorways 12 to 15 feet high in interior corridors, where grandeur serves no purpose. Staircases with risers requiring an unusually long stride window placements that make sense, only if you assume occupants taller than modern averages. All of this officially attributed to aesthetic choices, all of it dismissed as decorative excess. But stand in one of these buildings, walk the corridors, try to use the furniture that occasionally survives in museum storage. The scale isn't decorative, it is functional for someone larger. And the statues outside, the massive guardian figures, they match that scale exactly, as if they're not artistic representations at all. As if they're markers, indicators of who these buildings were actually designed for. The renaming becomes significant when traced systematically. Many of these statues originally had no attributions. No plaques, no inscriptions, no official designations. They were just there, part of the architecture. Then, over the course of the mid to late 1800s, attributions began appearing. Commissioned by this monarch, carved by that sculptor, representing whatever classical deity or historical figure fit the emerging national narratives. But the earlier records, the architectural surveys and city plans from the 1770s and 1780s, they don't mention commissions. They reference the statues as existing features, as inherited elements of structures whose original purpose had already been forgotten or deliberately obscured. The renaming wasn't documenting their creation. It was reattributing their ownership, claiming them for a new historical narrative. This pattern appears most clearly in former Tartarian territories. Cities across Russia that appear on 1700s maps labeled as part of Grand Tartary. By the 1820s, those same cities are firmly Russian, and the statues that were always there suddenly have official backstories. Commissioned by Catherine the Great, carved by imperial sculptors, representing Russian strength and classical learning. Except Catherine the Great's actual construction records don't mention these commissions. Her documented sculptors didn't have the capacity to produce work at this scale. The paper trail doesn't match the physical evidence. The same discrepancy appears in American cities that expanded westward in the 1800s: San Francisco, Chicago, Denver. Cities that supposedly grew from frontier settlements to sophisticated urban centers in 20 or 30 years. And somehow, during that explosive growth, they found time and resources to commission monumental statuary that rivals anything in European capitals. Statues that show weathering patterns inconsistent with the official construction dates. Statues that appear too old for the cities they inhabit. What if they were already there? What if westward expansion wasn't building new cities but repopulating old ones? What if the massive stone guardians weren't commissioned by American industrialists but inherited from whoever built the structures they stand beside? The photographic evidence creates another problem for the official timeline. Early photographs from the 1850s and 1860s show these statues already in place, already aged, already integrated into urban landscapes, but the commission dates on the plaques say 1840s or 1850s. 20 or 30 years isn't enough time for stone to weather. The way these surfaces show weathering, the patina, the erosion patterns, the settled appearance, all suggest significantly more time. Unless the dates are wrong. Unless the attributions came later, backfilled into historical records to support an emerging narrative about who built what and when. Now examine the statues themselves more carefully, not just their scale but their poses. They're almost always in positions of guardianship, holding doorways, flanking entrances, supporting architectural elements, positioned as if protecting or monitoring access to the structures behind them. And their expressions, when the faces are visible, aren't celebratory or triumphant. They're watchful, alert, as if the sculptors were capturing individuals performing an actual function, not creating allegorical representations of abstract concepts. This guardian positioning appears too consistently to be coincidental. Government buildings across Europe and North America feature the same arrangement: massive stone figures at entrances, positioned to flank, to observe, to create a threshold that must be passed, as if the buildings were designed with controlled access in mind, as if the guardians weren't decorative but functional elements of a security system we no longer understand. And here is where the evidence becomes impossible to dismiss. Some of these statues have tool marks that don't match the technology officially available when they were supposedly carved. Precision cuts requiring machinery that doesn't appear in historical records. Surface finishes achieving smoothness that hand tools struggle to replicate. Drill holes with dimensional accuracy that suggests mechanical assistance. All on statues officially attributed to early 1800s workshops using traditional techniques. The technology question undermines the entire narrative. If these statues required advanced tools to create, tools that don't appear in documented workshop inventories, then either the technology existed and wasn't recorded, or the statues are older than claimed and were created by a society with capabilities we haven't acknowledged. There is another detail that art historians consistently ignore: the weight distribution. These massive statues balance on architectural features that shouldn't support their mass according to standard engineering calculations from the period. A 10-foot stone figure weighs between 15 and 25 tons depending on the stone density. The mounting systems, the integration with the building structure, the load transfer to foundations, all of this requires sophisticated engineering knowledge that appears fully formed in the architectural plans without any documented development period, without trial and error, without the failures you'd expect from experimental techniques. The mount points themselves tell a story. Many of these statues connect to their buildings through joint systems that show evidence of modular design. As if they were created to be positioned and repositioned, as if the buildings were designed with standardized connection points that could accommodate guardian figures of specific dimensions. This isn't how decorative statuary works. Decorative elements are custom, fitted to unique architectural situations. But these guardians show standardization, repeating patterns. Common dimensions that appear across buildings separated by thousands of miles, Museums hold fragments that were never displayed, broken pieces of similar statuary found during building renovations or demolition projects. Stone hands measuring 3 feet across, heads with features that match the monumental guardians but were never attached to any known statue. Torso sections showing the same weathering patterns, the same tool marks, the same proportion systems, all catalogued as architectural salvage, all dated vaguely to the 18th or 19th centuries. None of it assembled into complete figures or studied as parts of a larger pattern. The archive photographs reveal even more. Images from the 1860s and 1870s showing construction crews working around these statues. The crews are dwarfed by the stone figures, and in several photographs, you can see something troubling. The statues are being cleaned, not installed. The work isn't positioning new sculptures. It is revealing old ones that had been covered, obscured, or deliberately hidden under layers of material that were being removed. As if someone decided it was time to bring them back into public view, as if they'd been covered during a transition period and were now being reclaimed under new attributions. Why cover them in the first place? Why hide massive stone guardians for decades only to reveal them later with new backstories? Unless the transition period was dangerous. Unless there was a time when their presence raised questions that couldn't yet be safely answered with the revised historical narrative. So they were hidden temporarily until the new story was ready, until the plaques could be installed, until the official explanations were established, and anyone who remembered different was gone. The Guardian theory aligns with other evidence patterns explored in this series. If Tartaria was a sophisticated civilization spanning continents, if that civilization employed individuals of exceptional size in administrative and oversight roles, if those individuals were documented in photographs from the 1800s, before mysteriously disappearing, then statues commemorating or representing them makes perfect sense. And if that civilization collapsed or was systematically erased, if the buildings were inherited by populations that didn't build them, if the new occupants needed to create founding narratives that justified their ownership, then renaming the statues, attributing them to new sculptors and new sponsors, becomes necessary, not to hide what they represented originally, but to incorporate them into a revised history where they fit the preferred story. The revision wasn't subtle. It was thorough. Archives were updated. Plaques were installed. Art history, textbooks established consensus, and within 2 or 3 generations, the statues became examples of 19th century neoclassical revival. Their actual origins forgotten, dismissed, or actively suppressed. But the physical evidence doesn't cooperate with the revised narrative. The statues are too old, too precisely carved, too consistently proportioned across too many locations to be independent creations by scattered workshops. They represent something coordinated, something standardized, something that suggests a common source. That source, the evidence suggests, was Tartaria, and the Guardians weren't artistic interpretations. They were documentation, records carved in stone of the people who built and maintained the structures we now inhabit. The deeper implication troubles conventional understanding of recent history. If these statues documented real individuals, if the proportions weren't exaggerated but accurate, then human physical diversity in the 1700s and 1800s included a population of exceptional size, a population that served specific roles, a population that appears in photographs, newspaper accounts, and burial discoveries before vanishing completely from the historical record, after approximately 1900. And if that population existed, if they were as widespread as the statuary suggests, then their disappearance represents one of the most significant erasures in recorded history. An entire category of human being documented in stone across multiple continents, removed from collective memory through systematic renaming and narrative control. The statues remember, even if we don't. They're still standing, still watching, still marking entrances to buildings whose original purpose we've forgotten. The faces carved in stone might be the only portraits we have left of the Guardians. The only record of what they looked like, how they stood, what presence they commanded, and the fact that we've been taught to see them as artistic exaggeration, as creative interpretation of classical themes, might be the most successful rewriting of history ever accomplished. Because the evidence was never hidden, it was relabeled. And relabeling is far more effective than destruction. It allows the evidence to remain in plain sight while ensuring no one asks the right questions. Who were the Tartarian guardians? Why were they documented so extensively in monumental statuary? What happened to them between 1800 and 1900? And who decided that their existence should be erased from official history, their statues reattributed, their memory systematically suppressed? The stone figures have no answers. They just stand there, massive and silent, exactly where they've always been. Guarding doors to buildings we didn't build, watching streets they knew before we arrived, waiting for someone to recognize them not as art, but as evidence of a different world, a different arrangement, a different truth about who we are and what we've inherited without understanding. The guardians are still here. We just stopped seeing them for what they actually represent. And that blindness, that trained inability to recognize what is directly in front of us, might be the most sophisticated historical revision ever achieved. The statues weren't renamed to hide Tartarian guardians. They were renamed to hide Tartaria itself, and it worked. Because when you control what something is called, you control what people think about it. Change the label. Change the story. Change the questions people are allowed to ask. But stone doesn't forget, and the proportions don't lie. And once you see the pattern, once you recognize the consistency, once you understand the coordination, you can't unsee it. The guardians are still on duty, still protecting knowledge they were carved to preserve, still waiting for the right questions. The only question that matters now is whether we're ready to ask them.